The rancher watched his mail-order bride step off the stagecoach, her hand trembling as she clutched a worn carpet bag. But it was the gold band on her finger that stopped his heart. She was still married. The dust kicked up by the departing stagecoach settled slowly around Harriet Lowell's boots as she stood motionless in the rutted road. Silas Brennan remained mounted, watching the woman he'd paid $40 to bring west. Her dark hair was pinned tight beneath a bonnet, worn thin by time and travel. Her dress was clean but carefully mended, every stitch a sign of making do. She was smaller than he'd imagined from her letters, lighter, more fragile than the capable woman her words had suggested. But it was her left hand that held his attention. Still wrapped around the handle of her carpet bag, the simple gold band on her finger flashed in the afternoon sun like an accusation. Harriet lifted her chin and met his gaze. His eyes were grey, storm-colored. His face was weathered, closed off, his jaw tight beneath several days of unshaved stubble. When he finally dismounted, he did so slowly, deliberately. He stopped 6 feet away, close enough to speak softly, far enough to give her room. "Mrs. Lowell." His voice was deeper than she'd expected, roughened by years of shouting across open land. "Mr. Brennan." Her throat felt lined with sand. The silence stretched between them like barbed wire. A wagon rattled past, the driver tipping his hat without slowing. Somewhere behind the general store, a dog barked. Normal sounds of a normal day, while Harriet's entire world balanced on the edge of this moment. Silas's gaze dropped again to her hand. She saw his jaw muscle flex. When he looked back at her face, something in his expression had shifted, though she couldn't name what. "The ranch is an hour north." He gestured toward his horse. "You can ride. I'll walk." "I can walk too." The words came out sharper than she intended. "Not in those shoes." He nodded toward her impractical Boston boots. "And not carrying that bag for an hour." Before she could protest, he took the carpet bag from her grip and secured it behind his saddle. Then he turned back and, without asking permission, placed his hands on her waist. Harriet gasped as he lifted her onto the horse, as easily as if she weighed nothing. Her body went rigid at the unexpected contact, the first time a man other than Daniel had touched her in over a year. Silas gathered the reins and began walking north, his back straight, his pace steady. Harriet sat frozen in the saddle, acutely aware of the ring pressing against her skin beneath her glove. She'd tried to remove it that morning in the boarding house, twisting until her finger screamed, but it wouldn't budge. The flesh had swollen around it over the months, claiming it as permanent as a scar. The sun beat down on her shoulders as the town fell away behind them. Ahead, the land stretched empty and endless, broken only by scattered stands of pine and the purple shadows of distant mountains. This was nothing like Boston, nothing like the life she'd known. Silas walked on, never looking back, and Harriet wondered if something bad had already happened, or if she was riding straight toward it. Silas's cabin came into view as the sun sank toward the horizon, so modest Harriet nearly missed it against the darkening hills. Rough-hewn logs chinked with mud. A stone chimney leaning slightly left. Windows reflecting nothing but the coming night. Behind it stood a barn in better condition than the house itself. He halted at the porch and turned to her at last. "You'll take the bedroom," he said. "I'll sleep in the barn." Harriet slid from the saddle before he could help her down. "That isn't necessary." "It is." He untied her carpet bag and held it out. When she took it, their fingers brushed. Both recoiled as though burned. Inside, the cabin was sparse but orderly. A table and 2 chairs, a stone hearth, a narrow bedroom barely wide enough for the iron bed pressed against the wall. Silas lit a lamp and set it down, then moved toward the door. "There's beans in the pot. Help yourself. He paused with his hand on the frame, his back to her. What I wrote in the letters, I meant it. You'll have time to decide. No pressure. The door closed before she could answer. Harriet stood alone in the lamplight, her throat tight. She'd answered his advertisement because there had been nowhere else to go. Daniel's family had made that clear after the funeral. Her own parents were long gone. Every dollar she'd had went into getting West. This stranger's offer, marriage in exchange for partnership, was the only lifeline left to her. She unpacked with mechanical care. 3 dresses, undergarments, a hairbrush. Daniel's daguerreotype. Too painful to leave behind, too painful to look at. At the bottom of the bag, wrapped in cloth, lay his grandmother's china teacup. The only thing of value she owned. The only thing his family hadn't taken. Through the window, she watched Silas build a fire outside the barn. He sat on a stump, shoulders hunched, staring into the flames. The isolation pressed in from every direction. No neighbors, no distant lights, just wind, darkness, and choices that could not be undone. Harriet looked down at her left hand. The ring seemed to pulse in the lamplight, a small circle of gold that might as well have been iron. She gripped it between her thumb and forefinger, twisted hard. Pain shot through her knuckle, but the ring didn't move. She tried again, harder, until tears blurred her vision. The flesh around the band swelled red and angry. She gave up and sank onto the bed, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. Through the thin walls, she heard the wind picking up. Somewhere far off, a coyote called. She thought of Daniel's face in those final hours, fever-bright and barely conscious. How he'd squeezed her hand once, then gone still. The ring felt heavier now than it had at his funeral. Heavier than it had on the train west. Heavy as a chain she couldn't break, linking her to a dead man while a living one slept in the barn because she couldn't let go. Morning arrived with roosters and regret. Harriet woke to see Silas already working, his silhouette crossing the window as he hauled water from the well. She dressed quickly and found the kitchen stocked with basics: flour, salt, dried beans, a slab of bacon. Her hands shook as she coaxed the fire to life and brewed coffee. When Silas came in, he nodded once and sat without speaking. She placed a plate of bacon and cornbread before him. He ate methodically, eyes fixed on his food. The silence felt heavy enough to suffocate. "Thank you for the meal," he said at last, rising. "There's fence work in the north pasture, if you're willing." Harriet reached for her shawl. "Show me." They worked side by side for hours, Harriet steadying posts while Silas drove nails home. The labor felt good after weeks of train cars and boarding houses. Her muscles burned, but she didn't complain. Near noon, Silas produced canteens and hardtack, and they rested beneath a scraggly cottonwood. "How long have you been alone here?" she asked. 3 years. Cholera took my brother and his wife. Before that, my parents." He stared toward the horizon. "The land's all I've got left of them." "I'm sorry." He shrugged, but something raw crossed his face. They returned to work until Silas spotted a rider approaching, a man in a suit, leather satchel at his side. Silas's jaw tightened. The rider dismounted and produced papers. "Mr. Brennan, I'm from Territorial Bank. Regarding your outstanding loan." Harriet watched Silas take the papers, watched his eyes move over words he couldn't read. His face went carefully blank, but his hands gripped the pages too hard. The banker droned on about payments and deadlines, using words designed to intimidate. When he finally left, Silas stood frozen, staring at the papers like they might catch fire. "I can read it," Harriet said quietly. "If you want." His pride warred with necessity. Finally, he handed her the papers and looked away. Harriet read aloud, her voice steady even as the words grew worse. 3 months behind on payments. Final notice. Foreclosure proceedings to begin in 60 days unless full payment received. How much? Silas's voice was rough. $240. She might as well have said 2,000. Silas walked to the fence post and gripped it hard enough his knuckles went white. Harriet folded the papers and approached slowly, like one might approach a wounded animal. My husband died 6 months ago, she heard herself say. Fever took him in 3 days. I held his hand until the end, but he didn't know I was there. Didn't know anything. Her throat tightened. His family wanted me gone the day after the funeral. Said I'd trapped him into marriage, even though his mother arranged it. They took everything. The house, the furniture, even the clothes he'd bought me. I kept this ring because I was wearing it when they came. Silas turned to face her. I don't love him anymore, Harriet continued. Maybe I never did. But I can't seem to let go. She held up her hand, showing the swollen flesh around the band. I tried to take it off before I came here. Tried until my finger bled. It won't move. Something shifted in Silas's expression. Understanding, maybe. Or recognition. I loved someone once, he said. My brother's wife. Before she was his wife. The admission seemed pulled from somewhere deep. Watched them build the life I wanted. When they died, I got the land but not them. Been carrying that ever since. The wind moved through the grass between them. 2 ghosts standing in late afternoon sun, finally seeing each other. The blizzard struck 3 days later without warning. Harriet was feeding the chickens when the temperature dropped so fast her breath turned white in an instant. Silas came running from the barn, grabbing her arm. Inside! Now! The wind hit like a blow as they ran. Snow came sideways, blinding and vicious. Silas slammed the door and immediately began stuffing rags into the gaps. Within minutes, the world outside vanished into white fury. They were trapped. The first day passed in strained quiet. Silas fed the fire while Harriet rationed their stores. They moved around each other carefully, speaking only when necessary. By the second day, the cabin felt smaller, the wind's howl drowning out thought itself. Silas finally pulled out a worn deck of cards and taught her poker by lamplight. Your tell is obvious, he said, almost smiling. You touch your collar when you're bluffing. I do not. But she caught herself doing it on the next hand. The third day brought a stillness that felt heavier than the storm. Snow pressed against the windows like walls. Harriet found a book on the shelf, pages yellowed and soft from handling. Poetry. She read aloud while Silas mended tack, and something in his stillness told her he was listening to every word. That evening, while she was washing their supper dishes, Silas noticed her wince. Her hands were raw from work, the skin cracked and bleeding at the knuckles. The flesh around her ring had swollen worse, the finger red and inflamed. He stood and disappeared into the bedroom without a word. When he returned, he carried a basin of warm water and a bar of soap. He set them on the table and pulled out a chair. Sit. Harriet obeyed, confused. Silas took her left hand in his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. He examined the swollen finger, his brow furrowed. Then he dipped her hand in the warm water. This might hurt, he said quietly. He worked soap around the ring, his movements patient and careful. The intimacy of it made Harriet's breath catch. No one had touched her with such care since before Daniel got sick. Silas's hands were steady, competent. He worked the soap deeper, easing it beneath the band. Try now, he murmured. Harriet twisted gently. The ring moved a fraction. Silas added more soap, his thumb working the tender flesh with impossible gentleness. Outside, the wind had died completely. Inside, Harriet's heartbeat was the loudest thing in the room. Again. She twisted. The ring slid past her knuckle, past the swollen joint, into Silas's waiting palm. Harriet stared at her bare finger. The skin beneath was pale, indented, a ring-shaped ghost that would fade but hadn't yet. She looked up and found Silas watching her, the gold band resting in his open hand like a question. "What do you want me to do with it?" he asked. The question held more weight than just the ring. Harriet knew that. So did he. "Keep it on the table," she said finally. "For now." Silas nodded and placed the ring on the wooden surface between them. Neither touched it. Neither looked away from each other. The cabin felt warmer than the fire alone could account for, and Harriet realized her hand was still resting in his. She didn't pull away. He didn't let go. Outside, the blizzard's aftermath settled into stillness. Inside, something new and fragile began. The ring lay on the table for 2 days, untouched, unspoken, but it changed everything. Silas moved back into the cabin without comment, sleeping on the floor by the hearth. Each morning, Harriet woke to find coffee made and the fire rebuilt. They fell into an unspoken rhythm. She cooked, he chopped wood. She cleaned, he mended. Words became optional. But the ring sat between them at every meal, a silent third presence. On the 4th morning, Harriet found Silas seated at the table, staring at the band in the pale light. He didn't hear her. "Judith," he said quietly. "That was her name. My brother's wife." Harriet poured coffee and sat across from him, waiting. "She was the minister's daughter. Came west with her father when I was 19. First time I saw her, she stood in the church doorway, sunlight turning her hair to fire." His voice scraped with old pain. "I'd practiced asking her father for permission. Had the words ready. Then my brother came back from a cattle drive with money in his pockets and confidence I never had." He lifted the ring, turning it slowly between his fingers. Watched him court her, watched her say yes, stood up as his best man at the wedding. Silas's jaw tightened. "Told myself I was happy for them. Built them furniture for their home, helped raise their first barn, all while something inside me turned to stone. But you loved her still. Every damned day." He set the ring down carefully. "When the cholera came, I prayed. Not for them to live. God help me, I prayed I'd feel something when they died. Relief. Freedom. Anything but the guilt." He finally looked at Harriet. "You know what I felt?" She shook her head. "Nothing. They were gone, and I felt nothing. Like I'd already buried everything that mattered years before." He pushed the ring toward her. "That's why I sent for a mail-order bride. Figured if I couldn't have love, at least I could have help. Practical. Simple." Harriet picked up the ring, feeling its weight. "Daniel was my father's business associate, 20 years older than me. The arrangement was made before I knew his name." She met Silas's eyes. "He wasn't cruel, just absent. We lived in the same house like strangers for 3 years. When he got sick, I nursed him because it was my duty. When he died, I cried because I thought I should. But you wore his ring. His mother put it on my finger at the wedding. Said it was tradition, that her grandmother wore it. Then it should go to her son's wife." Harriet's voice dropped. "I kept wearing it because I thought it made me a good woman, a proper widow. But really I was just too afraid to admit the truth." "What truth?" "That I never belonged to him. That the ring was just metal. That feeling nothing doesn't make you a bad person." She placed the ring in her pocket, not on the table. The gesture was deliberate. Final. It just makes you human." Silas reached across the table, his hand, palm up, an offering. Harriet placed her hand in his, and they sat that way as dawn broke fully, two people who'd carried ghosts learning they could set them down. Spring came slowly, then all at once. Snow melted into mud, mud dried into earth, and the earth exploded with green. Harriet had never seen anything like it. In Boston, spring meant window boxes and manicured parks. Here, it meant wildflowers covering the hillsides like spilled paint, and the air so full of bird song she woke smiling. Silas taught her to read the land. How to know rain was coming by the way horses stood. How to find water by watching where deer grazed. How to tell good soil from bad by the plants that grew there. She absorbed it all hungrily, her hands growing strong from work, her skin browning under the sun. In turn, she taught him letters. They started with his name, Harriet guiding his hand as he formed each character. His fingers were clumsy with the pencil, more used to hammers and reins. But he practiced every evening after supper, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. Like this? He showed her the word he'd written. Land. Perfect. Their shoulders were touching. Neither moved away. They planted a garden together, Harriet on her knees in the dirt, feeling more alive than she had in years. Silas worked beside her, and when their hands brushed reaching for the same seed packet, he didn't pull back. Instead, his fingers curled around hers for just a moment, long enough to mean something. The days grew longer and warmer. Harriet caught herself watching Silas as he worked, the way his shoulders moved when he split wood, the rare smile that transformed his weathered face, how gentle his hands were with frightened animals. She'd thought she knew what attraction felt like with Daniel, but that had been pale and dutiful compared to this steady burn. One evening, while checking the new fence line, a post gave way and Harriet stumbled. Silas caught her, his arm around her waist, her hands flat against his chest. They froze that way, close enough that she could see gold flecks in his grey eyes. "Harriet," he said, his voice low. Just her name, but it sounded like a question. Before she could answer, his horse whinnied sharply. They broke apart as a rider appeared on the ridge. A stranger, well dressed in expensive riding clothes, sitting too straight in his saddle. He approached slowly, his gaze sweeping over the modest ranch before settling on them. "I'm looking for Mrs. Lowell," he called out, his Boston accent sharp as broken glass against the western air. Harriet's blood went cold. "I'm Mrs. Lowell." The man dismounted with practiced ease. He was young, perhaps 30, with the kind of polished handsomeness that came from money and privilege. "Charles Pemberton. I was your late husband's business partner." He removed his hat, but his eyes stayed calculating. "I've been searching for you for months. There are matters regarding Daniel's estate that require your immediate attention." Silas moved closer to Harriet, not touching, but present. A silent claim. Charles noticed, his mouth tightening almost imperceptibly. "The estate has been settled," Charles continued, pulling papers from his saddlebag. "You're entitled to Daniel's holdings, considerable holdings, enough to return to Boston and live quite comfortably." The word Boston landed like a stone. Harriet felt Silas stiffen beside her. "I'm afraid you've traveled a long way for nothing," she said carefully. "I've made a new life here." Charles glanced at the modest cabin, the rough fences, the hard-packed dirt. His expression said everything. "Mrs. Lowell, surely you don't mean to stay in this wilderness when you could return to civilization, to your own people." His gaze slid to Silas with barely concealed disdain. "I'm prepared to escort you back personally. In fact, I'd be honored to." The offer hung in the air like smoke. Harriet opened her mouth to refuse, but Silas spoke first. "It's getting dark. You can bed down in the barn." His voice was flat, empty. "We'll talk more in the morning." He walked away before Harriet could speak, his shoulders rigid, heading toward the hills where his family was buried. Harriet waited until Charles retired to the barn before saddling Silas's spare horse. The moon was bright enough to see by, and she knew where he'd gone. The high country, the graves. The ride took an hour. Her thighs ached from gripping the unfamiliar saddle, but she pushed on. She found him sitting with his back against a pine tree, 3 wooden crosses stark in the moonlight. His horse grazed nearby. He didn't look up when she dismounted. "You should go back," he said. "Man like that doesn't belong in a barn." Harriet sat beside him, close enough their shoulders almost touched. "Man like that can sleep where I tell him. He's offering you everything. Money, Boston, your old life back." Silas's voice was carefully controlled. "What am I offering? A failing ranch and a man who can barely write his own name. Is that what you think I want? I think you deserve more than this." He gestured at the graves, the dark hills, the endless empty land. "More than a man who's got nothing but debt and ghosts." Harriet stared at the crosses, reading the names carved into weathered wood. Then she spoke, her voice steady. "Daniel came from money. Old Boston money. His family had a house on Beacon Hill with servants and a carriage. He took me to the opera, to society dinners where everyone knew which fork to use." She turned to face Silas. "And I was lonelier than I'd ever been in my life." Silas finally looked at her. His business partner Charles was always there, always watching me with that calculating look, like I was a horse he might purchase. She drew a breath. "Daniel's money didn't come from honest trade. I didn't understand it at first, but I learned. Bribes, schemes that ruined smaller merchants, money made from other people's desperation." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Charles is cut from the same cloth. That inheritance he's offering, it's built on suffering." Harriet reached into her pocket and pulled out the gold ring. In the moonlight, it looked dull, tarnished. "Daniel's mother gave me this ring and told me I should be grateful, that girls like me don't usually marry into families like theirs." "Girls like you?" "My father was a clerk. We lived above a dry goods store. I had one good dress and shoes with holes I stuffed with newspaper." Her fingers closed around the ring. "Daniel's mother never let me forget where I came from. Never let me forget I didn't belong." Silas was quiet for a long moment. "Why'd you marry him then?" "Because my father arranged it before he died. Because I had no other options. Because I thought security mattered more than happiness." She opened her hand, the ring resting in her palm. "I was wrong, Harriet. I wore this ring out of guilt and fear. Guilt that I didn't love him. Fear that without it I was nothing." She stood and walked to the graves. "But out here, I learned something. I learned to plant seeds and watch them grow, to mend fences and read weather, to find strength in my own hands." She turned back to Silas. "I learned what it feels like to be seen, really seen, not as a transaction or a burden, but as a person." Silas rose slowly. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that money can't buy what you've given me. Charles can offer me Boston and comfort and all of Daniel's blood money, but he can't offer me this." She gestured between them. "Whatever this is we're building." "And what are we building?" Harriet closed the distance between them. "Something real." They rode back at dawn to find Charles pacing the porch, his irritation poorly concealed. He straightened when he saw them approach together, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Harriet on horseback, her hair loose and dress dusty. "Mrs. Lowell, I must insist we discuss the estate immediately. I have business back east that cannot wait." Then don't wait, Silas said flatly, dismounting. Lady's made her choice. Charles's polite mask slipped. The lady hasn't heard the full offer. Daniel left her $18,000, Mrs. Lowell. That's more than this entire territory is worth. He shot Silas a contemptuous look. Certainly more than a dirt ranch with a foreclosure notice. Harriet climbed down without Silas's help, standing on her own feet. I appreciate you coming all this way, Mr. Pemberton, but my answer is no. You can't be serious. Charles stepped forward. Look at this place. Look at him. You're throwing away your future for a man who can't even read. He can read, Harriet said quietly. I taught him. How charming. Charles's voice dripped venom. Playing schoolmarm in the wilderness while your husband's fortune sits waiting. Daniel would be ashamed. Daniel is dead. The words came out harder than Harriet intended. And whatever fortune he left was built on the backs of people he destroyed. I want no part of it. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Silas looked up sharply. Storm's coming. Fast. He was right. Dark clouds boiled over the mountains, moving with unnatural speed. Within minutes, the temperature dropped, and wind tore through the valley. Rain came in sheets, then turned to hail, stones the size of eggs hammering the ground. Get inside! Silas grabbed Harriet's arm, pulling her toward the cabin. Charles followed, cursing as ice pelted his expensive coat. The storm hit with terrifying force. Through the window, they watched the creek swell into a raging torrent. Silas's face went pale. The livestock. They're in the low pasture. He was out the door before Harriet could stop him. She grabbed her shawl and followed. Charles called after them, but she didn't look back. The water was already knee-deep in the pasture. Horses screamed, thrashing against the rising current. Silas waded in without hesitation, catching a mare's halter and dragging her toward higher ground. Harriet grabbed another horse, her muscles straining as the animal fought in panic. They worked in desperate synchronization, moving livestock to safety one by one. The water kept rising. Harriet's legs went numb with cold. Her lungs burned. But she didn't stop. Charles appeared at the pasture edge, staying carefully on dry ground. You're going to get yourselves killed for animals. A wave of muddy water knocked Harriet off her feet. Silas caught her, steadying her against the current. They locked eyes for a moment, both soaked and exhausted, and something passed between them. This was who they were, who they chose to be. By the time the flood receded, they'd saved every animal. They stood in the mud, shaking with cold and adrenaline, and Charles stared at them like they were insane. You risked your lives for livestock. He shook his head in disgust. This is madness. You're choosing poverty and hardship over security, over civilization. Harriet looked at Silas, then back at Charles. I'm choosing home. Charles's expression hardened. Then you're a fool. He turned toward the barn to collect his things. I'll leave in the morning. When this place falls apart and you're starving, don't come crying back to Boston. That door is closing. When he was gone, Silas took Harriet's hand. They walked to the cabin in silence, their fingers intertwined, tracking mud across the threshold. The storm outside began to quiet. Inside, everything had changed. Charles left at first light without saying goodbye. Harriet watched from the window as he rode away, his straight back and expensive saddle disappearing into the morning mist. She felt nothing, no regret, no doubt, just relief. Silas came up behind her, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. You sure about this? I've never been more sure of anything. She took the coffee, their fingers brushing. But we still have the bank problem. 60 days isn't much time. 57 now. Silas's jaw tightened. Been thinking on it. Might be able to sell the north pasture. Won't get us all the way there, but it's something. No. Harriet set down her cup. That's your family's land, your brother's land. We'll find another way. There isn't another way. Harriet thought of the papers Charles had left on the table before storming out. Legal documents transferring Daniel's estate to her. $18,000. More money than most people saw in a lifetime. She'd refused it on principle, but principles didn't save ranches. She picked up the papers and read them carefully. Then she found pen and ink. "What are you doing?" Silas asked. "Something I should have done months ago." She wrote across the bottom of the document in clear, steady letters. "I'm signing the inheritance over to the Boston Widows Relief Fund. Women whose husbands died and left them nothing. Women like I would have been if I hadn't found your advertisement." "Harriet, that's a fortune." "It's blood money." She kept writing. "But it can do some good for people who actually need it. We don't. We need $240 by next month, or we lose everything." "We'll figure it out." She looked up at him. "Together." Silas crossed the room and took the papers from her hands. He read what she'd written, his lips moving silently over the words. When he looked at her, his eyes were bright. "You gave away $18,000. I gave away Daniel's ghost." She touched his face, feeling the rough stubble under her palm. "I don't want his money. I don't want his life. I want this. I want you." Silas pulled her close, his arms tight around her. They stood that way for a long time, holding each other in the morning light. Outside, birds sang. The land stretched green and alive after the storm. The future was uncertain, but they would face it together. Later that afternoon, Harriet found herself in the bedroom, pulling out the small wooden box from the back of the drawer. Daniel's ring lay inside, dull against the velvet lining. She picked it up one last time, feeling its weight. Once this ring had defined her, had trapped her in a life that wasn't hers. She walked outside to where Silas was repairing the fence, damaged by the flood. He looked up as she approached. "Will you come with me somewhere?" she asked. They rode to the high country as the sun began its descent. At the 3 graves, Harriet dismounted and knelt in the grass. She dug a small hole beside the crosses with her bare hands, the earth soft from yesterday's rain. Silas watched silently as she placed the ring in the ground and covered it. "This is where my old life ends," she said, standing and brushing dirt from her hands. "And my real one begins." Silas took her hand. "You're sure?" "I buried a ghost," Harriet said. "Not a memory. Daniel was real. His death was real. But he doesn't own me anymore." She turned to face Silas fully. "No one does. I'm choosing you because I want to, not because I have to." They stood together as shadows lengthened across the valley, 2 people who'd learned that sometimes you have to let go of what's dead to make room for what's alive. 6 months passed like pages turning in a book. Summer gave way to autumn, and the ranch transformed under their combined efforts. They worked from dawn until dark, selling wool and trading goods, scraping together every dollar. Neighbors helped when they could, bringing food and labor. The community Harriet had never known existed, slowly revealed itself. By October, they'd raised enough to pay the bank. Not easily, not without sacrifice, but they'd done it together. The morning after making the final payment, Silas disappeared into the barn before sunrise. Harriet found him there hours later, bent over his workbench, wood shavings covering his boots. He straightened quickly when she entered, hiding something behind his back. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Nothing." But his ears were red. "Silas Brennan, you're a terrible liar." He hesitated, then slowly brought his hands forward. In his palm lay a ring carved from dark oak, the wood polished smooth, simple but beautiful. Harriet's breath caught. Found this piece after the flood. It survived when everything else got swept away. His voice was rough with nervousness. Been working on it at night. Probably did it wrong. I don't know how these things are supposed to look. It's perfect. I'm not good with words. Never have been. But I've been practicing. He cleared his throat. Harriet Lowell, you came here as a stranger looking for a place to belong. You found a failing ranch and a man who didn't know how to hope anymore. But you didn't run. You stayed and taught me what it means to build something real. Tears blurred Harriet's vision. I can't offer you wealth or Boston society. Can't promise life won't be hard, but I can promise I'll work beside you every day. I'll learn every word you want to teach me. I'll build you whatever home you want, even if it takes the rest of my life. He dropped to one knee in the hay-strewn barn. Will you marry me? For real this time. Not as an arrangement, but as a choice. Yes. The word came out choked. Yes, Silas, 1,000 times yes. He slid the wooden ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, warm against her skin, nothing like the cold gold she'd buried on the hillside. This ring was alive, made from wood that had survived a storm, made by hands that knew hard work and gentle care. They married 3 weeks later in the small church in town. Harriet wore a dress she'd sewn herself from blue calico. Silas wore his cleanest shirt and boots he'd polished until they shone. The neighbors filled every pew, people who'd become family through shared labor and mutual respect. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Silas kissed her like a man who'd finally found his way home. That evening, they stood on the new porch Silas had built, watching the sun set over land that was truly theirs now. No debts, no ghosts, just 2 people and the life they'd chosen. Do you ever regret it? Silas asked quietly. Giving up that money, that life. Harriet looked at her hand, at the wooden ring that caught the last light of day. She thought of the woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach 6 months ago, wearing another man's ring and running from a life that had never fit. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who knew the value of things that couldn't be bought. Not for a second. She leaned into Silas's warmth. This is exactly where I'm meant to be. They walked inside together as stars began appearing in the darkening sky, closing the door on their past and stepping fully into the future they'd built with their own hands, their own choices, their own hard-won love. If this story touched your heart, click the like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of love and redemption. Share this with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to choose the life you truly want.